With the brilliance of your wisdom, O compassionate one, illuminate the darkness enclosing my mind, enlighten my intelligence and wisdom, so that I may gain insight into the Buddha's words and the texts that explain them. So in the context of the Treasury of Precious Qualities, we're presently going to begin the paramita of concentration. So overall, within the context of the Treasury of Precious Qualities, which is very much a text for practitioners. You know, you have texts that explain the view, the texts on the Prajnaparamita, the Madhyamika, and so on. And that gives us an understanding of reality. That gives an understanding of what it is, where it is our confusion lies, what it is that drives our confusion, what drives samsara, what it is that drives freedom, what are the characteristics of freedom, how do we find out how this exists within our own mind, and then understanding the logic of the path. So these kind of teachings we refer to as teachings on the view. Once we have that, then it's really important that we begin to apply that insight. And that's the practice of the path. And that's where we, for example, reflect on how rare it is to be born a human, the fact of impermanence, the law of cause and effect, the shortcomings of samsara and so on, taking refuge. And so this is where a text like the Treasury of Precious Qualities addresses this situation of wishing to engage with and practice and understand the nature of the path. So we're presently in the chapter on developing enlightened attitude, developing you could say the magnanimity that goes beyond just the ordinary self-centeredness that drives us. And that's where, on one hand, we understand the nature of things, the emptiness nature of things. And on the other hand, then we cultivate a greatness of mind that is about thinking about the nature of samsara, the nature of suffering as it exists for all beings. And that's where we then are determined to take the vow to become bodhisattvas and do something about that. Presently, the 9th chapter is then about how do we actually apply that. And that's where we first generate the intention to benefit sentient beings. And secondly, then we engage in the application. And the application then has these 6 sections on what we call the paramitas, which are essentially practice that goes beyond ego. And this practice doesn't mean meditation practice necessarily, even though that's what we're going to look at today, but it also involves practice like generosity, discipline, and patience, and so on. So that's where the paramitas really entails what leads us beyond. You could say actions that lead us beyond, or training in the bodhisattva mind, and understanding how this practice is intended to and how it has the skillful means to take us beyond the limitations of our ordinary, you could say, narrow-mindedness, our ordinary self-centering. So the paramitas are incredibly important. They're incredibly beautiful. And there's nothing not to like about, you could say, the application of them. But it's important for us to know and have some idea about what does this consists of. So that's where it's so wonderful that we have a text like the Treasury of Precious Qualities, and also we then have a text, the commentary from Kangyur Rinpoche that unpacks this. So specifically then, the paramita of concentration, we first look at the prerequisites, and let's just see here, 1991 and 93. So here it says, a wholesome land, a forest, flower-strewn, the haunt inhabited of peaceful waterbirds, beautiful to see, with walls and terraces of rock, and lovely with the young of heart and hind. The joy-bestowing woodland is a goddess, with her waist entwined with fresh and swaying traceries of moss. It's here that cuckoos, unafraid of harm, announce their tidings, sadness with the world. Go to such a place, all you who wish to concentrate your mind. Wealth and pleasures are like fleeting canopies of cloud, and life, a flash of lightning, shakes and trembles midst the gang of thieves, the sufferings of pain, of change, and sorrow in the making. So the commentary then tells us, in the forest, marvelous arrayed and colored like the iridescence of the peacock's throat, the ground is carpeted with green grass and every sort of flower. The branches of the trees are decked with leaves and blossoms of various kinds. It is a delightful place, filled with wholesome plants, caressed by the fresh scented breeze. Cool streams babble gently amid lakes and pools, encircled by green and grassy swards, populated by a host of swans, wild ducks, and other waterfowl, sweet-voiced and harmless. On the mountain slopes are natural caves set amid wonderful cliffs that are smooth and gleam like oil. Above and below are rocky walls of various colors. Near their summits, the mountains are adorned with ledges, the nesting place of birds. On the lower slopes live little deer, charming and playful, a delight to see. The forest is a natural source of joy and heart's ease. It is lovely like a goddess, her waist encircled with woven girdles of fresh moss. Cuckoos, fearless of harm, call with their sweet voices and sing of the weariness that draws one out of the world. People who wish to cultivate concentration should go to such delightful solitudes, so replete with pleasures that are in harmony with the Dharma. Excuse me. So, now what we very often encounter in the Buddhist teaching is really a reference to an age-old culture within these civilizations of going to forest dwellings, retreats, caves, places that are calm and where we can spend time practicing meditation, progressing on the path. Now, this really refers to civilizations where Buddhism has flourished and where there's a general accommodation for this. To go to the forest and stay there, to go to, these kind of locations is not an act of, you'd say, counterculture movement. It's not about getting away from the establishment. It, in fact, is a practice that's incredibly respected by the establishment. And it's very much being in alignment with an established tradition of noble persons that have done that. And so I think while in many Asian cultures, it's true, it's not as if you want your children, if you have a business, you very often you'd want your children to stay in the business. And so sometimes there's some resistance from families in Buddhist civilizations against their children going to places like that. For example, the story of Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, whose father didn't want him to become a lama. He wanted him to stay at home, can't take care of the family business, and so on. So that happens. But overall, in Buddhist civilizations, there is a tremendous respect for those who go to these places. And so there's a whole, you could say, moral support, and there's also a material support. When someone goes to such a place, then in addition to the respect, there's also very often, you could say, established infrastructure. You can somehow receive food, you can somehow receive material support in various ways. So that's where you can say these civilizations excel in terms of the existing infrastructure. That's not the case in the modern world. Buddhism, sadly, is new here. The science of what drives confusion and samsara and the possibility of enlightenment and so on is very new and somewhat alien to the modern culture. So that's where very skillfully teachers in the modern context, they'll often emphasize how, yes, it would be good to go to a retreat, but also you can practice wherever you are. So that's where the modern practitioner needn't be sort of stuck in a place of thinking, oh, I can't practice unless I go to a retreat. Someone like Kangyur Rinpoche will always emphasize how you can absolutely practice at any given moment. There's never, you could say, an excuse for not practicing. But at the same time also, there is universally an understanding of the value of going to a retreat. And of course, what is common to both, you could say, the traditional Buddhist civilization and our civilization is the fact that there's not going to be an entertainment. You could say we in the modern world, we're a bit more addicted to entertainment than traditionally students of the Dharma were. But nevertheless, there's a bit of salesmanship that has to take place. And that's where it's, if you look in the way of the Bodhisattva, if you look in a text like this, then there is, you know, extolling and praising the value of this kind of place. But when we understand the, you could say, how important the practice of the Dharma is, then this is, you could say, pure luxury. And also then we can appreciate that while we can practice now, to have these conditions is really worthwhile. And that's where we could possibly plan our holiday, you know. I mean, we could go to Ibiza, we could go to some Bali, we could go to places and have a wonderful time. But we could also find a place where it's calm and where we could focus and where we could begin to have some connection with just what we can call the lifestyle of concentration. So in the following, then there is a fair bit of highlighting the value of going to such a place. But again, I have to emphasize that in the modern context, when this is not possible, then it shouldn't mean that we can't practice the Dharma. We just need to understand that what essentially is happening here is that you can see the priorities of the path. You know, it's not about wealth. It's not about your friends. It's not about all these things that very often drive the distracted mind. And we can also appreciate the environment and that sages through the ages have practiced in, and appreciate how on the basis of such an environment they achieved these you could say the spiritual accomplishment. And then we can aspire to follow in their footsteps. And so then gradually, as there will be perhaps circumstances, then we can, you know, we can say, oh, I have the choice between, you know, spending a week in a great sort of party town, or I can go to a place where there's a possibility of practicing. And that's where we could very well then see, yes, if I get the chance, I'd really like to go to solitude. So that's a little bit about the modern situation, how what's being discussed here applies to us. But with that sort of, you could say, if you have that in mind, then the following here makes a lot of sense and is really worth contemplating. So then verse 93 says, craving to acquire, to keep, and to increase, beings are tumbled in this ruin-bearing torrent. Gripped by pride, by avarice and stinginess, they wander after death in shoreless seas of lower realms. So Kangyur Rinpoche then writes here, why is it necessary to seek solitude? The fleeting pleasures of this world are like the canopies of clouds that appear one moment in the sky and are gone the next. People immerse themselves in these enjoyments, claiming that they are necessary for their livelihood and indispensable for their survival. And yet the life of humankind is no more than a flash of lightning, a swiftly passing interlude, which can in no way be extended beyond its term, and is all the while attended by three sufferings, rampant like a gang of thieves: the suffering of change, the suffering of suffering, and all-pervading suffering in the making. And let's just have a look at that. Suffering of change is the fact that when we have things that we want, we lose them. When things are going well, then all of a sudden we lose these things, and things that we don't want, they come on us. So this happens to us all the time, the suffering of change. Then there's the suffering of suffering, and that's simply just physical pain, illness, catastrophes, tragedies, and so on that happen to us. And then there's all-pervading suffering in the making, which is as long as we are stuck in the fundamental delusion of duality, the fundamental confusion, then we're operating from a place that is essentially blind. And that's where we stumble, not understanding what it is that brings happiness and suffering, and having no idea about ultimate freedom. So these three sufferings are basic to the samsaric conditions. So Kangyur Rinpoche then continues, in particular, wealth and enjoyment are the occasion of ruin in this life and those to come. Beings are in a situation that is like a turbulent river rushing irresistibly toward the sea. They are constantly tormented and exhausted by the tasks of accumulating, preserving, and augmenting their possessions. Their minds are pulled this way and that by desires. They're never satisfied. When they possess a few riches, they become puffed up and look down on others. Fearful of losing what they have, they grow mean and stingy. They are so tight-fisted that they do not even eat their own food or wear their finery. As a result, they wander after death in the limitless ocean of the lower realms. So I think most of us can appreciate and nod to this. There's a, it's a familiar theme. Also, even within our culture as well, the sort of the volatility and you could say the folly of pursuing what is entirely just fleeting and impermanent, ultimately meaningless. And of course, here there's the added perspective of what's going to happen after we die. So that's where we then need to appreciate that having wasted this unique occasion on something that was utterly meaningless, then we continue perpetuating our confusion, which is then resulting in the lower realms. Yeah, thank you, Matt. Yes, that's true. Actually, if you go to, well, not just there, but in fact, there is a section within the Finding Rest, or what is it? The Finding Rest in Meditation, right? Where Longchenpa praises solitude. And of course, also, like I said earlier, in the Path of the Bodhisattva. But, oh yeah, so thanks. Song of the Enchanting Wildwoods. Yes, that is beautiful. So you have it there. Thank you, Matt. So the link is sitting in the chat. So then the next verse, the next stanza reads, precious things acquired deceitfully are like the clouds abundant with their rain. They are the cause of suffering, but those with little property are safe from enemies and thieves, and those content with what they have reached the highest peak of wealth. And that's where I like to point out there's a quote that's actually, there's an insight or almost a verbatim quote from two persons extolling the virtue of contentment. Curiously enough, they're very different, you could say, their backgrounds. One is Nagarjuna, an Indian sage, and also Alfred Nobel, who famously invented dynamite. But they both actually say, of all the riches there could be in this world, the greatest richness, the greatest of riches is contentment. Anyway, here Kangyur Rinpoche then writes, wealth and precious possessions gained by evil means and sinful thoughts and actions issuing from false and deceitful attitudes are black, like summer clouds, heavy with rain. They are the source of unbounded suffering, both in the present and in future lives. By contrast, those who own little are safe from enemies and robbers. Those who know contentment have reached the summit of riches. So again, that's, I think, self-explanatory. There you are, possessing very little. A burglar breaks in and wants to steal it all, and you can almost say, sure, go ahead, take what's in the fridge, take my chair and table, and that's it. So that's where that situation of contentment leaves you very safe from these kind of assaults. So that's with regards to the material and you could say situation. And then there's giving up attachment to bad company. Ordinary people are by nature childish. Their childish minds are clogged with clouds of faults. They praise themselves, disparage others. They have rough, defiled emotions, like a serpent's tongue. They think the wavering glories of this life will last forever. For what is done for them, they show no thanks, but only its reverse, and look with solemn frowns. They blow the fires of hatred with the winds of calumny. Like apes, they are the source of every kind of mischief. The belly of their sins is vast like some leviathan. Like vicious snakes, they harm all those they meet. Keep far away from childish folk who, like a fire, will scorch and burn the healing trees of virtue. Now let's just be clear on one thing also. You could actually say this is not, there's no value judgment here, which obviously looks seriously, it looks like as if there is, but just a fact that you cannot expect beings who are on the basis of ignorance then habituated to, and in fact have no choice, but simply just act on the impulses that they're conditioned to follow. So that's where, when there's no, you would say, path of wisdom that can cut through this, it's only predictable that beings of the world are going to continually act in ways that relatively are going to create lots of suffering and ultimately just keep them away from any chance of freedom. So that's where we can look at the world and we can just say, this is definitely not what you want to do, and also moreover engender compassion for beings like that. But until then, you look at the world and it's very often like, you know, kids sitting in a sandbox, you know, having, I always remember this as a kid, gripping the other's hair, and they gripping your hair, and then you say, I'm not going to let go until you let go. Then you have misery, tears, and of course this also applies in terms of all the madness that we see in this world. So that's where you could say when there's no resorting to alternatives, then it's predictable that individuals are going to follow their confusion and the causes of suffering. And so here then the commentary runs on the whole. Ordinary people are foolish and behave like spoiled children. Their mind streams are clogged with wrong thoughts and their actions are unvirtuous. So the wrong thoughts is what comes first with it, which are then the narratives based on what you like and dislike. And all of that, again, is based on your own self-centered agenda. You know, identifying as a person with, which is, you know, riddled with attachment and aversion, or identifying with nations or tribes or whatever it might be. All of that wrong in the sense that it's, if we want happiness, this is not what's going to bring happiness. And so once you act on that, then you lay down a pattern of karma. So that's the actions then. And unvirtuous, again, doesn't come from some absolute standard of what is good and bad. It's simply just that's the cause of suffering. So if you want to be happy, you need to put down actions that bring suffering. I mean, if you want to be happy, to put down the actions or act on what brings about happiness. And so when we say virtue and unvirtue, it sometimes sounds a little bit archaic. And, you know, you think, oh, well, virtuous people, they must be incredibly boring and sort of goody two-shoes and all of that. But it's simply just understanding, you know, if you plant a pumpkin seeds, you're going to get pumpkins. If you plant unvirtuous actions, you're going to get misery. So again, this is not somebody that sits up in the sky and decides, this is a good boy, this is a good girl. But it's simply just that we lay down seeds that are based on aggression, lay down seeds that are based on alienation. We lay down seeds that construct ourselves as poverty-stricken, needy. And as a result, then, these actions then become part of who we are, and we experience a world that reflects this aggression or reflects this neediness. So that's where, again, understanding karma is really just understanding what are the results of actions. So that's where these kind of actions that then come from confused individuals obviously bring about suffering. That's the point here. And then Kangyur Rinpoche continues, they praise themselves and say unpleasant things about others. They are filled with the venom of the defilements. Their attitudes and conduct are as poisonous as a snake's tongue, and they are surrounded by the harsh atmosphere of conflict. For such people, negative states are constantly on the increase. They think the fleeting, vacuous splendors of the world will last forever, and they're not grateful when spiritual friends do things to help them. And let's also be clear on the fact that, you know, us who in the modern world are continually exposed to news of what goes on somewhere else, or even just within the parliaments of our own, you know, indigenous countries. You know, we sort of go, oh, the politicians, they're behaving in a corrupt way. Well, duh, the politicians are just as immature, just as confused as anybody else. There's nothing to be expected. Occasionally, on the basis of their selfish agenda or whatever, their own confusion, they might sort of pretend to be nice, or they might, our wants might agree with their wants and so on. But we're not in any way talking about anything surprising. Everybody's predictably going to be waging war, waging crime, pursuing crimes of hatred, pursuing crimes of economic kind and so forth. So that's where, instead of being indignant about, you know, the president of this place or the prime minister of that place and the politicians or people in general, instead of being indignant about them, it's about being compassionate. We need to replace our sort of anger with people with compassion, understanding where it is they're coming from. But then again, also, this is where the point here is to not get sucked in by them, to not, you could say, begin to follow their practice or in some way get entangled with them. So that's where it says here, further describing such individuals, say they are irritated at the sight of people endeavoring virtuously and in harmony with the Dharma. Instead of being pleased, they're frowned and sullen. That's where also in our culture we have this sort of like, oh yeah, people who do this kind of, you know, religious things or whatever, you know, that's a waste of time and so on. Or if you just simply just don't necessarily agree with people. Whenever they feel the slightest resentment, which nevertheless burns into them like a fierce fire, they provoke quarrels and stir up the whirlwind of slander. They are as unstable and unpredictable as monkeys. Their actions are contrary to the Dharma, and they are great troublemakers. Their minds are centers of mischief, like the vast belly of a sea monster, gulping down all sorts of fish, like venomous snakes with their deadly breath. They bring ruin to everyone they meet. And with the fires of the hatred, they scorch and destroy in an instant the wholesome fruit trees of their own and others' minds. One must keep as far away as possible from such childish and destructive company. Yeah, there's someone here who's asking question, and perhaps for next time, the suffering of everlasting feeling of being not satisfied, wanting more. Which three categories in this? Well, that's the all-pervading suffering, which is the suffering of the samskaras, simply just the impulses. So that's where you have the immediate suffering of suffering, which is just pain and disaster, if you like. The second is that things are changing. We can't count on anything. simply because, well, ultimately they're empty, and anything that is conditioned or composite changes, is impermanent. But this one here that you're saying here, the suffering of everlasting feeling, being not satisfied, wanting more, and so on, that falls under the third kind, which is the all-pervading suffering. So, giving up attachment to objects of the senses. Worse than poison are the objects of the senses, for their fruit, when fully ripened, brings great harm, not only in this life, but all the lives to come. Though in the moment of their tasting, they are sweet indeed. There is no supreme mantra, and they are sweet indeed. And this no supreme mantra and no physic can relieve. So this is about our addiction to pleasure, which of course, again, in the modern context is what we call driving the wheels, you know. The whole consumer society is all about that, but this is of course not anything new. It's always been like that. The sort of craving of the senses. So it says here, the six senses stray constantly to the objects of desire, form, and so on. So that's form, meaning here what we see, then there's what we taste, there's what we feel, what we hear, and so on. And it says here, and these, when carelessly enjoyed, are more dangerous than powerful and swift-acting poison. Ordinary toxins, however, when not neutralized by medicine or the power of mantra, result only in the destruction of this present life. So the implication here is that this addiction, this constant going always towards the object and seeking pleasure in the object, that's something that we lay down as a habit that sits on our old ground. And this is something that we then will be pursuing lifetime after lifetime, whereas just regular poison that might kill you only has an effect in this present life. So Kangyur Rinpoche continues, by contrast, the fully ripened effect of the wrong enjoyment of sense objects is extremely damaging, resulting in the lower realms for many lives to come. So that's where if we, for example, begin to be addicted to or constantly seeking things, then we're always operating from a place of poverty and always wanting something that we don't have. And that constructs a subject that is always wanting and needy. And that's then what we refer to as the experience of the hungry ghosts. Or maybe being frustrated of not getting what we want, then this engenders rage, anger, aggression. And that's then where we construct the lower realms of the hells. Or maybe we're just simply just without any kind of discrimination, just tagging along, following what comes, and just wanting stuff and just relying on objects to be the cause of our happiness. And that kind of dullness results in rebirth as animals. So that's where it says here, the fully effect of this kind of addiction to the objects results in the lower realms. Kangyur Rinpoche says, to repeat, if people swallow poison, sweet as it may taste, they will suffer. They can, however, be cured by medicine and mantra. But through wrongly enjoying the objects of desire, beings will have to face the suffering of many lives, not just of one. And again, this is where it's so important when we approach a text like this, you could say that's written in a different cultural context, then it's really important that we, when we read, wrongly enjoying the objects of desire, that we don't conflate it with the kind of dogmas that exist based on some sort of absolute principle that is simply just a dictate or a prescription that this is right, this is wrong. Here again, it's about simply diagnosing what is it that leads to happiness, what is it that leads to suffering. And that we can verify on the basis of our own experience. We can simply see how this neediness is something that constructs a needy individual. We can see it in ourselves and others. So we needn't rely on dogma. And that's where then we can say wrongly enjoying the objects of desire. So again, that's where it's important we don't think of that as a dogma. If your mechanic tells you, you know, it's wrong to put diesel in a petrol engine, you know, it's not really that he's being dogmatic, even though it sounds dogmatic, that he says it's wrong. It's just that that's just how your engine works. It just doesn't work with the wrong kind of petrol. So that's where we need to continually come back to understanding the nature of the Buddhist teaching is not founded on dogma or these sort of categorical imperatives, but very much about an understanding of what works in terms of creating happiness. What is it that works in terms of ultimate liberation? It says here, medical remedies are powerless against such a predicament, meaning following the objects of desire. For their purpose is to treat only the 404 kinds of physical disease. So that's where ordinary medicine can only cure, you could say, things that have to do with this physical body. Let's see what the comment is here. A reference to the traditional classification of diseases according to the four medical tantras. So that's Tibetan medicine. What characterizes rightly enjoying the objects of desire? The insight into emptiness. So, for example, you come across teachings like the very advanced teachings of the Mahayana, known as Vajrayana, and that's based on insight into emptiness. And that's where the object of desire, known as empty, and there being no attachment to it, it simply does is an offering. And that's where there's no attachment and there's insight into insight into emptiness. And it also doesn't leave any karmic traces. On the contrary, then becomes a cause of merit.
Does that mean
that requires the view of understanding emptiness, and it also requires then the experience. And with that, that comes then, you could say, a detachment from the objects. And that's where simply just enjoying something that comes is done with you could say, an elegance. It's like, oh, nice. You know, and if you don't get it, you're not frustrated.
Jakob, if I can
Yes,
ask,
go ahead. Hold on. Let me just bump up my sound here.
Oh, sorry. I don't know if my microphone's.
No, you're good. We can hear you.
Okay. Does that mean that with that view, because I've always wondered about this, like that view of emptiness, does that mean that the contact or form conditioning contact resulting in either pleasant or unpleasant, is there any enjoyment taken by one with the view of emptiness from that contact or that the arising of that pleasant sensation itself, or is that completely neutralized and it's seen as empty as well? And
like a complete blah.
Sorry?
Like sort of complete blah. You know?
Yeah, well,
you give the Dalai Lama a great meal and he just goes, it's all empty to me.
Well, I don't know if I don't know how far if the view of emptiness extends to the visceral experience of the thing itself. And so I don't know how it works. So I thought I'd ask the question.
Well, think of it in terms of somebody who's just not very attached. You know, I mean, they would, I mean, so let's say the Dalai Lama is sort of well known to all of us, right? We kind of can visualize the Dalai Lama. And there we are offering a great meal to the Dalai Lama. He will be very happy. He'll say, oh, thank you so much, Matt. That was a really, delicious meal. And the thing is, what the Dalai Lama will enjoy it. Do you like the food, Actually, talking about this, and I hadn't intended that, but the Dalai Lama was on MasterChef in Australia, right? Ages ago. It's still, the recording is still on there. And he actually very sweetly says, as a monk, I'm not supposed to, have preferences for nice or bad food, something like that, right? But but the implication here is that there's not the attachment. So there is, you could say, yes, there's the visceral experience, but there's just not the sort of, I'm hankering for it, you know? And that's
And
where you can see the point here is the sort of the poverty that's always like hankering, you know, I have to
yes,
have this, you know.
and is that also with respect to then the separation, as in when that thing is done, there is also no aspect of having to cling to the thing that has passed.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Something to aspire to, right?
Right. Yeah. I was just wondering whether it was just this
And, you know,
like total, like no preference whatsoever between anything.
you know, even on a very sort of immediate level or very simple level, like Thompson Rinpoche very often praises Shambhala training, which is very much of being in the world. And he would, in that context, he would make a point about, you know, we shouldn't deny ourselves pleasure. It's just about not being attached to them. You know, they're not being the addiction. And that's where that sort of addictive, you could say, personality is what sits with us in our innate disposition that carries on lifetime after lifetime. Yeah. Okay. We have to be quiet not to wake up Nancy. Anyway. Okay, we'll continue here. So then in the root verses here, 99, it says, for those who have not tamed the elephant of mind, nothing is more false or more deceptive than the objects of the senses. Till this compounded aggregate is borne away upon the buyer, let peaceful forest glades be a home for you. So a bit along the lines of what we've just been talking about here then, Kangyur Rinpoche says, until one is able, through the practice of vipassana, to tame the elephant of one's mind, which is intoxicated and driven wild by the deceptive poisons of desire objects, one will never truly perceive the latter's defects, for they always appear as positive qualities. So what we mean here is, of course, training the elephant of taming the elephant of the mind means no longer being ruled by the confused mind. And vipassana simply means wisdom. Of course, sometimes we were in the Burmese tradition, vipassana is the label that you give to the practice of meditation. But again, that technique in itself contains the two aspects of what we call shamatha and vipassana. And what vipassana implies is discerning, insight, that we're not deceived by appearances. So, for example, the realization of emptiness, that is vipassana. And that's where, as long as we don't have that discerning, then we're continually going to be lost. You know, we might actually be polite and say, oh yeah, no more cake for me, you know, but that's really just being polite and doesn't necessarily mean we have, you could say, the insight into emptiness. And that's where the sages sort of, you know, you could say elegance and modesty is vastly different from just our conventional polite behavior. But that again, even though we are only then conventionally polite, it already actually sows the seed of not giving into our impulses. So already there we are somewhat on the way to, you could say, get over the cause of suffering just by being, you could say, polite. But it is, of course, not at all what is implicit in vipassana. So that's where, as long as we're not free of this delusion, then we're never going to be really able to cut through this deception. He says there is nothing more specious and liable to deceive people than the objects of the senses. And again, we can see this particularly in our world. Because of course we say that there are higher realms in which some beings they exist at a very subtle spiritual level and, you know, have no perceptions. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they've cut the cause or the root of this potential hankering for the objects. It's merely just pacified. But then again, to begin to have some experience of this freedom, there has to initially be the mind that's calmer, and also the mind that is not deceived, where there is an insight that informs us of the, you can say, futility of the objects. So that's where then Kangyur Rinpoche continues. Therefore, until the time comes for the compounded aggregate of this physical form to fall apart. In other words, when death occurs and the body is placed on a bier and carried away by 4 men, or loaded on an ox and transported to the cemetery, Jigme Lingpa encourages us to dwell in peaceful woodland glades or other places of solitude, away from the distractions of busyness and society. So again, here it is that many of us not having that option, then we need to also be aware that we can also practice in the context of a ordinary life in the modern society. But at the same time also, we can make this aspiration that we could go to such a place and maybe opt to go there sometimes. So then here then comes in praise of solitude. Wilderness and secluded places, both are good, inspiring us with sorrow at samsara. No trade is there, no farming, no bad company, no tiresome threats of impositions, duties, need for livelihood. The birds and beasts say nothing untoward. All things needful, fruits and limpid water, there abound, and spacious caves and shelters made of leaves. To live within the cool shades of the trees is bliss indeed. Would that we might take it for our dwelling place. So, Kangyur Rinpoche says then, secluded place and solitude in the wilds are actually technical terms. The Tibetan is Wensa and Dutra or Naktra. And that's always, it will say in the, if you, for example, practice sadhana, it will say go to, a Wensa or a secluded place or so on. So that's a Buddhist technical vocab for you. The first refers to a location a mile distant from a village, at the limit of what is considered to be the village territory. By contrast, solitude in wilds is more than 2 miles distant from a village. Such places where there are no irritating and harmful circumstances are a delight to the spirit. So again, I have to say a little bit about the infrastructure that's lacking in the modern context. And that is that we don't have this situation where there's a community that actually respects and attends to such hermits. And that's why very often, for example, the Tibetan word for monastery, gompa, actually has a particular distance that's not too far from the places that actually will support you materially. So there is, again, here an implication of a support system that we don't have. But then again, you might go to a place a place in some location, and usually you can find a little hut where, the cafeteria is not too far away. Anyway, it says it is there that a weariness with samsara will develop. There one will avoid the society of people whose attitudes are false, who are engaged in the worldly occupations. Excuse me. So you avoid the society of people whose attitudes are false, meaning confused, who engage in the worldly occupations of trade, agriculture, and so on. Again, the modern person would always say, yeah, but if it wasn't for people doing that, you couldn't go and do your spiritual thing. That's of course true. But at the same time, there is generally a possibility of choice, and very few people actually would take the choice of going and pursuing the lifestyle of a hermit, living in solitude and so on. So there's good reason to actually identify the value of this. So that's where then this is extolling or praising the virtues. Likewise, one will not be harassed by the obligation of paying taxes or commissioned for compulsory service or the payment of duties. One will no longer be fretting about whether one has enough to live on. One will be free from the troubles of wage earning and the need to depend on helpers or attendants, or indeed on anyone else. So this, of course, again, is a particular kind of society that you had in Tibet and other traditional Buddhist societies, which obviously is structured different from the one we're familiar with. But again, I think we can still take ownership of what's being said here and sort of find a way in which the message that is implicit in this can translate into our particular context. It says, out in the wilds, there are only the carefree birds and wild animals, the sound of whose voices does not grate upon the ear. In places such as these, noble beings find a joyful abundance of all that they need, pure water of all kinds and all kinds of fruit and edible plants. Natural caves are found in the rocks and shelters of grass and leaves, spacious enough to accommodate the four kinds of activity. How wonderful if we could find such pleasant dwellings, rejoicing in the cool shade of the trees. Let's see here. Eating, so the four kinds of activities: eating, sleeping, walking, and sitting. So that's you could say that's the that's the minimal sort of nature of our existence at the very core. 102. The fashion of the forest is transformed to greet its guests as the four seasons pass. Nothing there provokes defilement. See, the teachings we may trust have said that boundless merit comes from even 7 steps to such a place. So that is where we often traditionally say, even just making some movement, doing something in terms of trying to get to a place where we could practice, has tremendous value. Kangyur Rinpoche comments, one who lives in such a place is like a traveler constantly arriving in a different place. For outwardly, the forest transforms itself to reveal the passage of the season, changing its raiment as summer turns to autumn. And yet, in all this, there is nothing to provoke the arising of defilement. Actually, some of you might have heard of Matthew Ricard. And Matthew, from his retreat up in the mountains outside Kathmandu, a place called Nama Buddha, he actually took photos over, I can't remember how many months, and just basically looking out from where he was. And it changes incredibly. He called this book, I think he called it Immovable Journey or something like that. But just simply, you can think you might be bored, but no, it's always changing the location. Excuse me again. It is thus that Jigme Lingpa praises solitude and instructs us to attend to the Buddha's utterly reliable words when, for example, he declares metaphorically that to take 7 steps towards such a place brings unlimited merit. The Samadhi Raj Sutra says, greater than making offerings of flowers, incense, food, and every pleasing thing to the Buddhas for an entire kalpa, is to take 7 steps in the direction of a solitary place with a mind that is weary of samsara. The merits of such an act are unbounded. Leaving on one side all cares for life and limb, meditate in solitude, in perfect peace. Work upon your mind with diligence and dwell in loneliness like heart and hind. Okay, I think we'll stop here today. If there's any questions, you're very welcome.
If I may, it's not really a question, but more just to link up the 2 main points we saw today about looking for conducive environment and let's say give up attachment to worldly pleasures. I understand we're faced with a dilemma in our modern society. At the same time, one might wonder, does it seem realistic that we can really give up all our far-longing habits without having a conducive environment to do that?
Well, we don't have much choice.
Right.
That's the thing. And that's where also we should be a bit sort of positive about our situation and say, okay, I can do this. And, even if we can't take 7 steps towards a complete solitude, we can take 7 steps towards our meditation cushion. There might be a place in our house where we sit and meditate. And already there, something takes place that's, you could say, radical. So we shouldn't, I think, give up entirely. And we could possibly speculate that even going towards that meditation cushion could actually bring about the circumstances for us finding, you could say, a greater degree of solitude.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, Nancy, you're with us again.
What was that?
I had difficulty
Nancy.
with the time.
I know. I mean, some of you, I don't know, Matt. I don't know if Matt's in Australia, but you mean this is it in the US? This would be in the middle of the night, right? In Australia, late in the evening.
I'm in Canada right now. It's 2:30 in the morning.
Oh, bless your heart, Nancy, for being here with us.
Respect the commitment.
Very nice. Matt, where are you?
Fiji at the moment.
Oh gosh, what time is it there?
9:30.
Evening?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
It's a good time.
Okay, thank you all of you for joining here. We'll just conclude with I think I forgot the dedication. I'll just find the dedication. What? Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. So let's just see here. Yeah. So thank you very much for joining us here, and yeah,